So we're going to go on here, past the story of Abraham here. And this is the page that you would be on here. Not much to look at, but these 3 lines in yellow here. But I'm going to be telling you a lot about the story of Jacob. First of all, let's talk a little bit about Isaac. Isaac, where does he get a wife? Well, Abraham really wants Isaac to have a wife from their people, okay? And so Abraham sends his most trusted servant back to Padan Aram to find a wife for Isaac. And I'll spare you the whole story because I don't have time to tell every little story and every little detail. I just want to tell you enough to really get some of the major motifs across. So I'll spare you the whole story of how he gets a wife. But this servant does go and finds the girl that God has intended, and she is willing to go and marry Isaac. And her name is Rebecca, good Jewish name. And she is actually, let's see here, first cousin once removed, I believe, from Isaac. A first cousin once removed would be like the child of your first cousin. I have a whole bunch of first cousins once removed. They're the children of my cousins out west. So that's the relationship of Rebecca to Isaac, if I remember correctly. But this servant brings her back, and Isaac loves her. I mean, couldn't be any happier about the choice, apparently. And they do get married. They have a problem, though. Rebecca seems to be infertile. And by the way, you're going to see a lot of repeating motifs in a lot of these stories. But the whole idea of infertility is one that will repeat again. And so the idea also of the firstborn son according to age not actually getting the blessing of the firstborn with the double portion and the transmission of covenants and all. This is going to be a repeating theme too. If you remember with Abraham, it was his younger son, Yitzhak, who's 14 years or so younger than Ishmael, that actually is the one that receives the blessing that was given to Abraham and receives the bulk of the inheritance. So these are just a couple of themes that we'll see recur again. But anyway, in this case, there's no long story about, waiting many, many years. But after a number of years, Isaac goes to the Lord and prays to God because Rebekah has not been able to have children. And so God opens her womb and she ends up having twins. They are fraternal twins. They're not identical twins. So whether they're conceived on the same day, I don't know, but they are born on the same day. When they are born, the first one to come out, they named Esau. And Esau, when he comes out, what's interesting about Esau is he's very, very hairy for a baby, and he's very, very red as well. After Esau comes his fraternal twin, whose name is Yaakov or Jacob. And he looks very different. Jacob is more what you would imagine, I guess, more of the normal amount of hair you'd expect to see on a baby, and more darkly colored hair, not the bright, red hair or whatever. Interesting thing is, though, when Esau is born, he's the firstborn, so he's the first one people can hold up and say, it's a boy. So he is the one legally that would be considered the firstborn that should receive the blessing of the firstborn, which includes a double portion of, everything that the father owns and is leaving for an inheritance, as well as the firstborn son being the recipient of any special covenants or privileges or honors that the father has received that are supposed to carry on to future generations after the father's life. So Esau should be the one here. But again, we're going to have the same motif where the firstborn doesn't end up getting the blessing of the firstborn. But this is going to be a very different story how this one works out. Every one of the stories is very different. Why? The firstborn isn't the one that ends up getting the blessing of the firstborn. So this will be a different scenario here. But anyway, when Esau is born, the strange thing is his brother Jacob, who's still in the womb, when he comes out, his brother's Jacob's hand is actually holding on to Esau's ankle. Now, I don't know how much, babies understand what's going on. I don't think any of us can remember being born. But theologians have made an awful lot about this, as if the babies, before they were born, were struggling as to who is going to be the firstborn, and Jacob holding on to Esau's ankle or his foot, the place where your foot spreads out enough to where you can get a hold on it. You might call it the ankle. Actually, Yaakov more closely means heel, but again, that's where the foot spreads out where you can get a hold on it. And so it's very interesting that Jacob is holding on to Esau's heel. So when they name him Yaakov, Yaakov actually is derived from a root that means heel. What's really interesting about this is that sometimes there are names that end up resembling the character or the events of the person they refer to in a way that people never dreamed. There are many words that sound like other words, many consonantal roots that are very similar. And as we'll find out later on, this consonantal root for Yaakov, which means, a heel or an ankle, a foot, also can be used to refer to a shyster, if you will, a con man, someone who's not to be trusted. And the funny thing is, this idea hung on for thousands of years. Now, many of you that are younger may have never heard this, but that's only because there comes a particular generation where, for some reason, the older generation just doesn't pass on some of the sayings to their children. And so I'm not sure if it's the generation right before me or the one right before that. I mean, I have adult grandchildren, so I'm really old. But when I was a kid, here's my point. If someone said something to me like, oh, don't get involved with him, he's a heel, everybody knew what that meant. If you say he's a heel, it means he's despicable. He has no honor, he has no virtue. He'll stab you in the back. He's not to be trusted. And so that whole idea of a heel meaning someone who is, a con man or a thief or not to be trusted, hung on for thousands of years. Now, I'm quite sure that when Rebecca, named Jacob, she wasn't naming him that because she thought that he would resemble the idea of a heel, meaning a con man or a criminal or whatever. She named him that because he was hanging on to his brother's heel. So he was named for being a heel grabber, if you will. But we'll find out later on that name suits him a whole lot more than probably Isaac or Rebecca would have ever dreamed when he was named that at birth. So anyway, as they're growing up, Jacob always envies the birthright of his older brother Esau. And, he knows, obviously, about Abraham's story. And, the children are taught all about their parents' stories and grandparents. And you learn all about the history of your family. It's who you are. And you learn to recite these stories. And you'll be taught to recite them correctly and so on. So he knows all about Abraham's story and all about, the miracle of his father Isaac's birth and everything. And he really, really wants this blessing. He really wants this blessing of God. And he certainly wants the double portion that comes with being the firstborn son as well. And so he envies this his entire life. Now, again, I'm going to have to skip a few stories here. Just, if you know some other stories about this, I'm just skipping them because I have to get to the point here. But there comes a point later on in life when both of the sons are grown, and Isaac has gotten very old and he's gone blind, and as elderly men sometimes do, I guess. And Isaac seems to think that his time may be at hand. He may not be living that much longer. We'll find out later on. He does hang on for quite a bit longer, but he apparently thinks, the end of his life is coming. It's a good time to pronounce the blessings on his sons, which is what a father does, pronounces the blessing of the firstborn on the firstborn and any other blessings on the other sons that come up. And the father has been imbued with this authority by God to pronounce this blessing on his sons. And it is something that is taken very, very seriously, and there's thought to be great power in the words of these blessings. Very different from our idea of a blessing today. Today, when we say, I bless you, it usually just means that I have good thoughts towards you. I wish the best, but nobody really thinks there's any power in it. And we'll talk more about this in just a few minutes, but it's a very different idea back here, as you will see. So anyway, Isaac calls for his sons and decides he is going to pronounce the blessing. And he wants his firstborn son first, calls for Esau. Now, he has always liked Esau best because Esau is a great hunter. Esau will go out and he will, he's a very successful hunter. And when he comes back, he will make these savory steaks that Isaac just absolutely loves. On the other hand, Jacob is mom's favorite, probably because he's always around. He's not out running around in the woods hunting or whatever, but he's around, the ranch. He's supervising the under shepherds and so on. And he's the one that's around that can be counted on. So this is Rebekah's favorite. Okay. And Rebekah and Jacob here are going to get involved in a little bit of a scheme. So first off, Isaac calls Esau and says, look, go out and, hunt me something and bring me back a nice meal so that I can, pronounce the blessing on you. So Esau goes running out to, hunt as quickly as he can and get something prepared. Well, Rebekah hears about this. And so she calls Jacob and basically says, this is your chance. Go into your father and pretend to be Esau and get that blessing. And obviously we got a problem here. Jacob doesn't look like Esau, but that's not a problem. Of course, his father's blind. Doesn't sound that much like him either, and he's certainly not as hairy as Esau. So what they decide to do is, first of all, he takes some of the hides with the hair and puts them on his arms and on his neck, so he feels very, very hairy. And his mom gets a bunch of Esau's best clothes that kind of smell like Esau and the fields where he goes out hunting and all of this, and puts that on Jacob, and then makes one of the steaks just exactly the way Isaac likes it. So Jacob goes into Isaac with this savory steak and manages to convince his father Isaac that he is Esau. His father Isaac puts his hand on him and feels the hairy neck and the hairy arms and smells like Esau. And of course, the smell of the savory steak is overwhelming. And so Isaac goes ahead and eats the steak and pronounces the blessing of the firstborn on Jacob, thinking he is Esau. And all of these stories, by the way, until we get to Moses, all of these stories are from the book of Genesis, if you ever want to go back and read them yourself. Once we get to the story of Moses, we're actually starting the book of Exodus, the second book of the Bible. So anyway, this works. And so Jacob leaves, and he's managed to steal the blessing of the firstborn. Esau comes back from the field and comes into his father with the steak, and his father's already full and says, but, who is this that, brought me a steak, before? And they realize that Jacob has tricked Isaac, his father, and has stolen Esau's birthright. And of course, Esau is, very, very upset. And, says, Dad, don't you have a blessing for me too? Please bless me. And, his dad does, but this blessing is nothing compared to the blessing he just gave to Jacob. And so I'm sure Isaac is pretty darn frustrated that he was taken advantage of, and Esau is just fit to be tied, that Jacob has stolen his blessing of the firstborn. And before we go on, if there's not bells going off in your head right now, if there's not a big red flag going, wait, this makes no sense, maybe you're not thinking of these as like real people. If these stories made no sense, if they seemed incredible to believe, people would have not held on to them for thousands of years and continued to find meaning in them. This is not a fairy tale. In a fairy tale, the green dinosaur can dance with the pink giraffe, and it's fine. But if I'm reading the newspaper and it talks about giraffes and dinosaurs dancing, now I'm like, wait a minute, this can't possibly happen. They're different genres. So if you look at this as a story of real people, somehow it has to make sense. And there's a whole bunch of things that don't make much sense, but a lot of people never really question them. And I'm going to help you question a whole bunch of them here, because if these are real people, and if we are supposed to understand what it's like to be them and learn something from these stories do have to make sense. They can't be so incredible. The things people say and the things people do can't be senseless. They can't be meaningless. So let's look at this. Isaac pronounces a blessing on Jacob, thinking he's Esau, and Jacob has deceived Isaac. So then Esau comes in, and Isaac basically says, too late, I already gave the blessing to Jacob. What is wrong with this story? Simple. What would happen today? We would say, wait, you entered into a contract under false premises. Therefore the contract is null and void. If I marry a girl and she finds out next week that I'm married to another girl, obviously our marriage is null and void. So we have this idea of entering into a contract under false pretenses nulls and voids the contract. That makes sense? And so why is this not annulled? Why does Isaac, not say, not fair? You pretended to be someone you weren't. Let's have a do-over. Why doesn't he do a do-over? We would certainly do that today, right? If you went to work for a company, you told them you had a degree from MIT, told them you'd worked for IBM for 3 years, and they hire you. And you're doing a great job, but a month from now, they get around to checking your references, and they find out you never went to MIT, and you never worked for IBM. Do you think you'll get to keep your job? I think not. I think they're going to fire you. And that is because you've entered into this relationship under false pretenses. So this is the way we think of things today. We would never honor a contract that was entered into under false pretenses. So why can't it be undone? Well, first of all, are we sure it can't be undone? Some people might suggest that, well, maybe somehow Isaac saw that this was God and just accepted it. But that doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Isaac seems pretty perturbed by this, and I think if he could have taken it back, he would have. But there's more convincing logic here. If there was any chance that Isaac could have taken this back, Jacob and Rebekah would never have used this strategy, right? Now you already see that this is not the way we look at things today. So why can't it be undone? And the best way I can explain this is that when the Father pronounces these words, there's power in the words. Now, the power may have come from God, but those words themselves, when the Father speaks them, they have the power. And when the words go out, whoever it is they hit, that person gets the blessing. It can't be undone. It's like magic. Like I said, this is not a blessing just like wishing someone well or, but this is like magic. There's a very powerful spell, if you will, that comes with this. And the best way I can explain it, perhaps, let's say that, late at night, 3 a.m, I hear some noises in the living area of my house, and I think there might be a burglar. And so I get out of bed and I grab my 9mm, and I go and I look around the corner and I see a shadowy figure dart across the living room. And I unload my clip and drop this person, and I turn on the lights, and it's my wife laying there bleeding out on the floor. Do I get a do-over? Do I say, oh, I didn't know it was you, and all the bullets come right back out of her body, go back into the gun, and everything's, No, you don't get a do-over. And that's the way it is when you pronounce a blessing. It's like, you've done something that can't be undone. So again, this is a very different way of looking at this than we do today. Now, it's going to be hard for you to keep this in mind because it seems so different from what you're used to, but I'll remind you. But for now, there's 2 things you have to keep in mind the best you can. And number 1 is this blessing is not what we think of as a blessing today. Okay? It's like magic. Okay? And secondly, there's power in it. When you receive the blessing, there's a power that goes with it. You are blessed. It will cause you to be prosperous. It will cause you to be successful. There's power in the blessing. So try to keep those 2 things in mind, and the story will make a lot more sense. Anyway, after this, of course, Esau is very upset with Jacob. And at one point, it appears that he is thinking about maybe doing harm to Jacob, maybe ending his life. And Rebekah knows it. And so Rebekah calls Jacob and says, you got to get the hell out of Dodge. And so she tells him about her brother, whose name is Laban. And Laban lives back where Rebekah came from. In fact, Laban's featured in the story when Abraham's servant goes to get a wife for Isaac. Laban's her brother. He lives in Padan Aram, which is, today it's kind of Syria, but it was, near the border between what would be Syria and Iraq today. But this was where the city of Haran was. Where Abraham and Sarah's father, Terah, died. If you remember, before they left and finally went into Canaan land. We talked about this in the last video on Abraham and Abraham's life. So this is where Jacob goes. He goes to Padan Aram and to find his wife's brother Laban and live with him. And family is huge. Okay, family is a very, very big deal. Okay, Laban is going to be seeing his nephew that he's never seen before. In fact, he may not know that this nephew even exists. Okay. I mean, maybe Rebekah and Laban aren't Facebook friends. I don't know. Maybe one of them's not on the social media. But anyway, it's a very, very big deal, to see someone in your family like this. So he will be probably very, very well received. And I don't think he is going to go in and tell Laban everything that's really transpired. I don't think he's going to go in and say, look, this all happened because I stole my brother's blessing. And then, this is probably not information he's going to share, right? So anyway, in going to Laban's, I will spare you the whole story, kind of like I did with Abraham's servant going to get Rebekah as a wife for Isaac. But as Jacob goes to Laban's area, he meets Laban's youngest daughter, whose name is Rachel. And he likes Rachel. He falls in love with Rachel. We don't know how old Rachel is at the time. She might be, an early teenager or whatever, which is, by the way, not exactly too early in age to be espoused to a man at this particular time in history, though that doesn't happen right now. And but Rachel does have an older sister as well. Laban's older daughter is named Leah. And Leah apparently is a good girl, but she's got a problem, and that is she has weak eyes. Now, scholars are not quite sure how to necessarily translate this, but a very common idea is that maybe you could see that there was something weak about the muscles in her eyes. Maybe she was a little bit cross-eyed or something like that. Anyway, some guys probably think that's kind of cool, the cross-eyed, hey, baby. But Jacob doesn't roll that way. Jacob likes the girl that can see straight forward. He likes Rachel. As we mentioned at the beginning of this whole series, everything is defined by covenant. So what ends up happening is Laban welcomes him almost as if it was one of his own sons and puts Jacob in a position of some authority over the other shepherds and gives him a lot of flocks and herds to take care of. And he makes a covenant with Jacob that Jacob will work 7 years for the hand of Rachel in marriage. And it says in the text that, the years went by very, very quickly. Jacob was so happy, got to see her every day and knows she's going to be his wife. And so, everything's looking pretty good here, apparently. And again, she might have been very young when Jacob met her, so it's not like she's turning into an old spinster or something like that at the time. So 7 years passes, and it's time for the wedding. And so what happens is they have some kind of wedding ceremony, but as it's getting dark and it's the wedding night and it's time for Jacob to go in and consummate the marriage, there's a switcheroo that's done. By the way, consummating the marriage, that means that you have sex with your wife. Whatever the ritual is, it is ratified. It is ratified by consummation, okay, by sex. So who you go in and have sex with, that's who you're married to. So what happens is it's probably dark and you can't see really well, and the sisters are probably about the same size, or who knows. But anyway, Jacob goes in and ends up, consummating the marriage, having sex with his beautiful wife, and wakes up in the morning when he can see a little bit better and looks over next to him, and it's Leah, hi, honey. And Jacob, of course, is not pleased. Leah was not the girl that he wanted. So, of course, he goes to Laban, and he's upset. And Laban's answer to Jacob in terms of why he did this, I'm going to give you the whole spiel here, and then we're going to unpack it piece by piece, because there's an awful lot here that shouldn't be skipped over. So what Jacob says is basically it is not proper to give the younger daughter in marriage before the older daughter, which would bring shame on the older daughter. Therefore, it's okay, just fulfill Leah's week. That means the week for the honeymoon. And when that week is over, then you can marry Rachel. But you'll have to work another 7 years for her. Now, was that a mouthful or what? We're going to have to unpack this piece by piece by piece. First of all, before we even start unpacking it, I want to ask you a question. Do you think that Laban always intended to deceive Jacob? I ask this in my classes, and I usually get a whole bunch of students that say, yes, he must have been planning this for a long time. But first of all, you've forgotten something that I told you. And secondly, you haven't really thought about the length of time that went by. One thing I told you is family's everything. Do you think that Laban sees his nephew, his sister's son, his sister he loves and misses and hasn't seen in years, and he meets his sister's son and gives him a big hug and says, flesh of my flesh, you're welcome here. Do you think he's thinking at this time, I'm going to rip you off, sucker? I don't think so. He would have to be a devil to do that. That's not the way it is with family. So that's the first thing that mitigates against this conclusion that a lot of people have not thought, because maybe today for you, family doesn't mean quite as much. It certainly doesn't in the United States of America and a lot of places in Western Europe. They've just kind of lost this whole idea of the importance of family and elder reverence and all kinds of things. The second thing you might have failed to think about is the fact that it's been 7 years. It is entirely likely that Laban's thinking, oh, 7 years, I'll find a husband for, Leah in 7 years. And at the end of 7 years, he hasn't found anyone that's interested, maybe because of this eye problem here. And he starts to realize, oh my gosh, I've got a problem here. And so as bad as this seems, Laban's probably trying to find about the most righteous way he can solve the problem. He's not going to take away what Jacob wants. Jacob wants Rachel. He's going to make sure Jacob gets Rachel. But to not bring shame on Leah, she has to get married first. Stop. Why would it bring shame on Leah? As long as both of the girls are home, it doesn't necessarily bring shame on either one. The father has a great deal of power. He can decide how long he wants to keep the daughters at home. But if a younger daughter gets married and the older daughter is at home, it becomes apparent to everybody that the older daughter is not desirable. There's been a problem finding someone who would take her. Whatever dowry the father is offering, however rich it is, it's not worth it to anybody. They don't want her. So that would bring shame upon her. So that's the first thing. So again, what Laban does is he decides that he is going to kind of deceive Jacob into marrying Leah, but then he's going to tell her, no, you can have Rachel too. You just had to marry Leah first. So it didn't seem, so there was no shame brought upon Leah. But then he says, you have to work another 7 years for her. And Jacob agrees. Why? Why doesn't he just say, and I tricked you, so, hey, go ahead and take the second one for free or whatever. Well, the answer is pretty much the same answer we just gave you, not to bring shame on them. One girl is worth 7 years of work and the other girl is worth nothing. That certainly brings shame upon the girl that is worth nothing. Now, here we get into a bit of a problem, because which girl is it that he worked for the first 7 years and which girl the second 7 years? Well, in terms of the way anybody else would see it, the legality of it, if you will, the first 7 years must have been worked for Leah, because Leah was the one that got married at the end of the 7 years, and then he marries Rachel and has to work another 7 years for her. So that's the way it would look legally. And so if there was no price to pay for the second wife, it would probably bring more shame on Rachel than it would on Leah. Now, of course, Jacob doesn't see it this way. He knows he worked the first 7 years for Rachel and not Leah, but nonetheless, the answer is the same. They have to be worth the same amount, or it would bring shame on both of them. Now, the next thing that we're going to ask here is, why does Jacob put up with this? Why is there not, some furious confrontation and we see the rage of Jacob, but nothing like that happens. At least it's not recorded. Jacob, once he realizes what's going on, he tends to roll with the punches and take this very, very well. This switcheroo and having to work another 7 years and getting a wife he didn't want. What exactly is the problem here? Well, let's stop right here. Bear everything we just said in mind, and let me present another motif here. We mentioned first, you already know this, that God chooses people that are sometimes not the people you would think he would choose. They may not have the right qualifications, they may not be in the right place, socially, and in some cases, they're not even very ethical people. Why in the world would you choose them? But, as we said, God sees what they're going to be when he gets done with them. And this is the case with Jacob. He certainly is not anything that any God should want to enter into a covenant with, as much of a shyster as he has been. So why doesn't Jacob resist? He knows he deserves this. This is the God that, that chastens. This is the God, he knows the stories of Abraham. He knows all the stories of Isaac. He knows all of these stories. He sees how God dealt with his father and his grandfather to make them better people. And there's a lot of stories we, of course, weren't able to cover, only having a certain amount of time. And so I think Jacob recognizes this right away, that this is God's chastening. By the way, chastening is a fancy name for discipline/punishment. So another thing that's interesting, and that is, as God is prescribing chastening, or discipline to remedy this character flaw, this situation, his chastening is often quite appropriate. It's kind of like the discipline or the punishment fits the crime. And this is another motif that you will see. And also God seems to have a little bit of a sense of humor at times as well. So let's think about this. Jacob knows he deserves this. I mean, it's kind of hard to get all uppity and upset, that someone has done you wrong, when inside you know what? I deserve this. Why does he deserve this? I usually ask in my classes for students to come up with ideas, and sometimes they'll come up with a few, but they usually don't get them all. First of all, we know he deserves it. He was tricked. Didn't he trick someone else? Yes. He tricked his father, and he ripped off his brother. Now, let's think about this. How was he able to trick his father? He was able to trick his father because his father could not see who it was. How was Jacob able to be tricked? Because he could not see who it was he was having sex with. It gets better. Next, how did Leah manage to successfully impersonate Rachel? The same way that Jacob managed to successfully impersonate his brother Esau, with the help of a parent. So just as Rebekah is telling Jacob, okay, this is what you do, Laban is telling Leah what to do. Now, Leah obviously is not going to disobey the wishes of her father. Jacob would have had more opportunity to perhaps challenge his mom, but he's more than happy with the plan that she's come up with. So in both of these cases, one sibling is pretending to be another sibling with the help of a parent. And the siblings, having been successful in imitating the other, are entering into a contract that cannot be undone. Just like that blessing cannot come back off of Jacob so that Isaac can now give it to the right son, Esau, Jacob cannot become unmarried to Leah just because it was not the girl he thought he was sleeping with. There's another one. We're not even done yet. How about this? What did he steal from his brother? Well, he did steal from his brother, obviously, the right of the firstborn, but in terms of what the blessing brings with it, materially, what does he get? He gets a double portion, twice as much. How much did he end up paying for the wife he wanted? A double portion. He had to pay 14 years of labor instead of 7. Now, all of these things are they can't be coincidental. And Jacob knows this. He sees, oh my God, this is perfectly designed by God. What are the chances of this being a coincidence? None. He knows he deserves this, and this is why he's rolling with the punches here. Okay? And, but he now begins another 7 years working for, in his mind, the Leah he didn't want, but in terms of the way it looks to anyone else, working for Rachel, and he certainly would not fail to work that 7 years and bring any shame on Rachel because she's the one that he loves. Now, here's where we get into another firstborn issue, okay? Now, obviously, the women are not receiving inheritances based on, firstborn, secondborn, or whatever, but as we mentioned before, when men have multiple wives, which is very often the case, the wives have rankings. There's always a number one wife. And so who is number one wife? Well, legally, it looks like it's Leah because number one, she's the older of the two, and number two, she was married first, and Jacob paid for her first, so she's obviously number one wife. But in Jacob's mind, Rachel will always be number one wife. He doesn't care what it looks like legally. So we have another issue with the idea of a firstborn here. And we're going to see this a few more times here, by the way. So he's working 7 years for Rachel, still at Padanaram, working for Laban. And at this point, he starts having sons, and one daughter, actually. And I guess I'll tell you the story, most of the story about the sons a little bit later here. But for now, while he's working the second 7 years, Leah is not the one that he loves. He loves Rachel so much more. That's who he wants to be with, doesn't really have any desire towards Leah. And of course, probably breaks Leah's heart. But God is going to kind of even the playing field, so to speak. And so God makes Leah exceptionally fertile. But Rachel's barren. Rachel can't have children. Again, you're going to see these repeating themes over and over again. So Leah starts having kids right away. And she ends up having 4 sons. Boom, 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 boom. And Rachel still hasn't had any child at all. So, of course, Rachel is probably feeling like she is going to be seen as being cursed. I mean, to not be able to have a child in this time, that's the goal of every woman, is to get married to a good man and have children. And I guess the only thing worse than not being able to have children is not having any man that wants you, that wants to give you children. But in this case, Rachel is afraid that she's going to look like she's cursed. Here's her sister with 4 sons, and she can't have a son. So what does she do about this? Think repeating themes, repeating motifs. She does the same thing Sarah does. She brings her handmaid to her husband Jacob, and her handmaid, by the way, is named Bilhah. She brings Bilhah to Jacob and says, okay, she's going to be my surrogate. She'll have sons for me. So Jacob says, okay. And Bilhah does end up having a couple of sons for Rachel. But after this, basically Leah says, no fair. If you're going to sleep with my sister's handmaid, you have to sleep with mine. So Leah gives Jacob her handmaid, whose name is Zilpah, and Jacob sleeps with her, and Zilpah ends up having 2 sons too. Okay, so after this, apparently Jacob hasn't slept with Leah in quite some time, and Leah actually makes a deal with Rachel. One of Leah's sons has actually had a successful hunt and brought back some mandrakes, which are going to be great for dinner, and Rachel really wants them, and so she makes a deal with Leah. And this is the price Leah wants. I'll give you my son's mandrakes that he caught, as long as you tell Jacob he has to sleep with me now. And so this was the deal. So Rachel goes to Jacob and says, you're going to have to go sleep with Leah tonight. I mean, that's the price I paid for these mandrakes I'm making for your dinner or whatever. And how horrible is that? I mean, the only way Leah gets some action is if her sister goes to the husband and says, okay, you got to sleep with my sister. How humiliating. But anyway, Leah ends up having 2 more sons. Now let's stop and just take inventory here. We got 4 sons for Leah. We got 2 for Bilhah. We got 2 for Zilpah. And then we got 2 more for Leah. So Leah's got a total of 6 sons. Her handmaid Zilpah has 2. Rachel's handmaid Bilhah has 2. That's a total of 10. And Rachel still has no sons. And finally, God has mercy on Rachel, opens her womb, and she finally has a son. This is the 11th son of Jacob, and his name is Joseph. He is the first son of Rachel, however. Now, this is where we're going to get into some strange firstborn inheritance type stuff. As I mentioned before, when we were talking about Abraham, when you're trying to figure out who the firstborn son is, it's more than just the age. It has to do with the firstborn son of number 1 wife. And number 1 wife is, really the valuation of the man of the household. And so obviously number 1 wife for Jacob is Rachel. Even though she's younger, even though he married her second, even though by the time she has a son, it's the 11th in a line of sons, still that son is number 1 son. That son's going to get the birthright. Joseph is going to get the birthright. How do you think his older brothers feel about that? Well, let's go back to the story of Jacob's labor for Laban. And remember, he's worked a second 7 years for his wife. We'll come back to the issue of the sons later on because it ends up being an interesting story. So after the second 7 years is over, he stays and continues to work for Laban for another 6 years. And at this point, they make an agreement, they make a covenant. And to make it really, really easy and simple, I'll just tell you that what Jacob agrees to is that he is going to receive all of the different babies of the animals, whether they're calves or whether they're kids of the goats or whether they're lambs of the sheep, but all of them that have some kind of a recessive gene manifested. Now, if you know how recessive genes work, the parent has to have the gene on the father's side and on the mother's side. They both have to have it. And the baby has to get a sperm cell and the egg cell that both have the recessive gene. And then when the two match up, then you see the recessive gene. This is why, you can breed 20 cows and they're all solid brown, and the 21st calf comes out and it's got like white spots or streaks or stripes or something like that. That's a recessive gene. And you'll see that. If you've ever, bred any other kinds of animals, if you've bred dogs or cats or whatever, you may have had a sire or a dam that had recessive genes, and every now and then you will have a puppy or a kitten that has very, very different coloring or patterns or whatever because of the recessive genes. So what Jacob agrees is that he is going to remove from these different flocks that he's been managing all of the ones that demonstrate recessive genes, and those are going to be his herds, okay? And after that, it'll be easy to determine if there was any, dishonesty, because if he ends up with any animals that do not display recessive genes, then he could be accused of stealing them from, either Laban or one of his other sons. He has other sons also that have huge flocks and herds. So there's some competition building here. So Laban says, okay. Of course, Laban, starts hiding the the ones in his son's flocks and so on that have the recessive genes. He's not being completely honest at this point. I think he's starting to resent Jacob's prosperity, because what happens is, at this point, as soon as Jacob makes this covenant with him, all of the animals that Jacob has are just consistently having babies that demonstrate these recessive genes, whether they're spotted or speckled or striped or mottled or whatever. They're displaying these recessive genes. And so he is gaining many, many, many animals, to his flocks and herds and so on. And Laban's got to be wondering, what is up with this? And yet Jacob can't be accused of any kind of dishonest practices. It's probably pretty clear that God is blessing him. And as much as Laban might not like the fact that it seems like Jacob is being prospered so much more than he and his sons, still, at the same time, he's probably thinking that, God is obviously blessing Jacob. And maybe this is one of the reasons he takes it as well as he does. But, as we'll find out, he has actually changed the terms of the covenant 10 different times during the 6-year period, trying to find a covenant arrangement where Jacob isn't just like, taking him to the slaughter, so to speak. But it doesn't matter, whatever he chooses. If he says, you have the striped ones and they all are born striped. You have the mottled ones, they're all born mottled. So there's some kind of supernatural power on Jacob's life. Now remember, this blessing that he got, this is not nothing. This blessing that he got is magic. It really is favor. It really does produce blessing. And now that God has punished him and disciplined him appropriately for what he did, he is being blessed. This blessing that he stole from his brother is producing great benefit for him. Now, to make a long story really short, after another 6 years, it's been a total of 20 years that Jacob has been with Laban. And at this point, his flocks and herds are so big that they are starting to take up too much land, and they're getting confused with other flocks and herds. And remember, we talked about this with Abraham and Lot too. And the servants end up fighting with the other servants because, their number one job is to, keep the animals that are committed to your care safe. And so we talked about how sometimes the land just can't bear you both. You have to move farther away. So that's a very short explanation of why Jacob finally realizes, he has to leave. And so he is going to go back to where he came from, Canaan. And of course, his brother Esau is still there. Now, it's been 20 years, and Jacob has no idea if Esau is still mad at him or not. So obviously, this is something that is probably weighing heavily on him, and he's thinking about it a lot as he leaves. And as I mentioned before, we're going to come back to the story of the sons a little bit later. Let me finish this next story here. So anyway, and I am leaving out a number of details to get through the stories quickly. So if you happen to have read these stories and you want to ask me about any of the details that I am not including, by all means, send me a message, through Canvas, send me an email, something like that, and I will be happy to answer any questions or respond to any observations you may have regarding any of these facets of the stories that I have not included in my account here. So anyway, Jacob is heading back, and he doesn't know how Esau is going to receive him, but he has to go and make this right. There is a very interesting encounter that happens when he gets to a place called Peniel. And it says that he struggles with a man all night till the break of dawn. Now, we've already talked about angels, and you already know from the previous video, angels are always men. They're never women, they're never children, they never have wings, they always just look like men. And you usually figure out later on that they're angels because of the message they're bringing or, something. So he struggles with this man, and we're going to find out later on this man is the angel of the Lord, obviously. And so it says he struggles till the break of day. And at the break of day, this angel of the Lord says, I got to go. Let go of me. And Jacob won't let him go. He's literally hanging on to the angel and won't let him leave. And you probably already are thinking this might be a bad idea. Well, what the angel does is he touches Jacob just right on the inside of his thigh and throws his whole leg out of joint. In fact, Jacob limps for the rest of his life because of this, and he still won't let go. So this guy has some determination. What is Jacob so determined for? What does he want? What he says is, I will not let you go until you bless me. Now, first of all, this tells you right here, it's the angel of the Lord. Jacob has recognized that this is an angel that speaks with the authority of God. Not sure exactly how he figured that out or everything that has happened over the course of the night until we get to the culmination of the story here. But he knows this is the angel of the Lord. He knows that this angel is able to pronounce a blessing on him, and he's not going to let the angel go until the angel pronounces a blessing on him. Let's stop here and think about this. Why does he so desperately want a blessing from the angel? Well, the first thing that's going to pop into anyone's mind is, he's going to be seeing his brother Esau in a day or two, and he probably hopes that Esau is not going to kill him. And so any blessing that says that he's going to live long and prosper kind of eases his mind. Okay, that's good. But let's ask it a different way. Let's assume that Esau, was not there, or that he knew that Esau wasn't mad or something like that, and Esau wasn't part of the problem. Let's look at this just in terms of why he would so desperately want a blessing now. Okay? Why does he need a blessing? I mean, he's blessed. He has all of these animals, huge flocks and herds. He's absolutely rich. He's got 2 wives at this point and 11 sons. Okay? What's he need a blessing for? Are you thinking about it? Well, imagine that I stole a car and I drove it over the border into Mexico or something like that. Nobody's looking for the car there. And say it's a Ferrari. It's a really expensive car. And so everybody, in the land that I'm going to thinks, oh my God, Steven Meigs is really cool. He's driving around this Ferrari, because they don't know I stole it. And the question is this, does the car just stop running because I stole it? No, it's still a Ferrari. It still runs, it still takes me where I want to go. It still makes me look good, but I know I stole it. I know I didn't deserve it. And let's say that something happens later on and I become a more ethical person and I decide, I don't want to be driving a stolen car anymore. I want a car that's mine. I want a car that I paid for, so that I don't have to disrespect myself driving around in this car. That's the kind of ethical maturity that does happen in many people's lives. Let me give you another example. Let's say that you go online, and by the way, maybe I shouldn't tell you this, but you can go online and find places where you can buy a fake degree. And they will duplicate whatever the seal is of the college you want the degree from. And you can pay them $15 or $20 and get this copy of a fake degree that says that you're a doctor of something or other. So let's just say I was a party animal. And, all I was trying to do was impress my friends. So in my party room, I just bought one of these and put it up on the wall. And all my friends came over and went, whoa, dude, you're so cool. And, everybody gave me free drugs and all the girls wanted to sleep with me. And that degree on the wall made me look pretty cool. But a few years later, I'm not satisfied. I'm not happy. I decided, what? I want to go to college. I want to actually get a few degrees of my own. And so I go to college and I end up getting 3 degrees, say. Okay, and I end up with an MBA, Master's of Business Administration, and I open up a company, and I have my office, and on the wall in back of my desk, I hang up my degrees. Do I hang up all 4 of them? Well, of course not. I hang up the 3 that are real degrees that I earned. Why don't I hang up the other one next to them? I mean, it looks good, right? It looks just as good. I know it has no value. I know it was not intended for me. There's some deception involved here. So this blessing that Jacob has, I mean, it may run really well like the Ferrari. It's blessing him, but it's a car he stole. This blessing, this is his brother's blessing. And it's been working. But he wants a blessing from God for him. He does not want to go through his life counting on a blessing that he stole from his brother. So Jacob has become a more ethical person. Okay, he's getting his priorities in order here. He wants God's blessing for him. Now, obviously, as I said before, some of this has to do with he's going to be seeing Esau very, very soon here. But still, this does represent that he's becoming a more ethical person. Now, here's where it gets really cool. The angel says, finally, he agrees to bless him. And he says, your name shall no longer be Jacob, but your name shall be Israel. Your name shall no longer be Jacob, but your name shall be Israel. Because you have struggled with God and with man and have prevailed. You've struggled with God and with man and have prevailed. But the interesting thing about this is that in Hebrew, this is a play on words. The consonantal roots of words, we call them consonantal because they only have consonants. There's no vowels. So this is what we're dealing with here. So the consonantal root of these words struggle and prevail. And as I said previously, priest, there are some scholars that have proposed that perhaps these words have the same consonantal root. And, the vowel sounds which are attached to them may be slightly different, but they're similar enough to where this is a play on words that is meaningful. It could be translated as either prevails with God or struggles with God. Israel literally means struggles with God or prevails with God. Now, most scholars are going to, if they have to give you one translation, they're going to choose struggles with God. And the reason they're going to choose struggles with God is not just because he has obviously struggled with God and God has struggled with him, and he's finally prevailed with God, but only because God prevailed in his life. The reason most scholars are going to choose struggle is because this is a common motif in all of the major 3 monotheistic religions. All of the monotheistic religions understand that struggling with God is part of your faith. And we're going to talk a little bit more about this when we get to Islam. And I'll give you a heads up why. Because the word struggle in Islam is jihad. So Israel literally means jihad with God. Or, to use the Arabic term, Israel literally means jihad with Allah. Bet you didn't know that. So obviously the way we're thinking of jihad today after 9/11 and so on, the word has been perverted. The word doesn't mean what it's supposed to mean, but there's many words like that that you just can't save because they've been too perverted, like Holocaust. Holocaust is not going to mean what it was supposed to mean. It's not a burnt offering. It's always going to be this horrible genocide of 6 million people under the Third Reich of Adolf Hitler. You're not going to use the word for anything else. If you're a Palestinian, you're not going to use the English word crusade for anything else. As soon as you say crusade, you're thinking about a period of time over a couple hundred years where all kinds of armies came from Western Europe trying to kill all of the Muslims in the Holy Land and take their land back for the Jesus that they said sent them into battle to kill them all. Crusade is just not a nice word if you happen to be a Palestinian. So there's some words that can't be saved. But I do want you to know that the word jihad originally just means struggle. And there's different ideas of how we struggle with God. Obviously, we're going to struggle against evil, in our lives, in the outer world. But the greater jihad is always going to be the struggle against evil in our own hearts. Okay? This is the real battleground. Okay? I'm defeating whatever in my heart. mitigates against my complete devotion to God, whatever lessens my affection for God. This is what I'm fighting in my own heart. And so struggle has these and certain other aspects that, again, I'm going to talk about in more detail when we get to Islam, because I have to kind of unpack this whole idea of jihad as some kind of holy war, because again, this is a perversion of the original understanding of the word. So, struggles with God. That's what Israel means. Struggles with God. You've struggled with God and you've prevailed, or God has prevailed, however you want to see it. So this is an important name change. From this point on, whether I say Jacob or whether I say Israel, it's the same person. Okay, and you'll see him mentioned both ways after this in the biblical text. He's sometimes called Jacob, he's sometimes called Israel, but same guy. God changes his name as recognition of the fact that he's a better person. God has prevailed in his life and has made him someone that God can now bless, that can now enter into this covenant with God, and this name change goes along with it, Israel. Now, let's move on here. Next, he is going to see, as we said, his brother Esau. He doesn't know if Esau's mad at him or not. He couldn't watch his status updates on Facebook because Esau had blocked him, I guess. So he doesn't know whether Esau still wants to kill him or not. So when he meets Esau, and again, I'm going to make a series of events very, very short here. Before he sees Esau, he sends all kinds of gifts to Esau, flocks and herds and precious gifts and all of this. And of course, he's trying to soften him up. He's trying to show that, he's favorably disposed towards him, obviously is regretful for the way he's hurt him. And he has demonstrated all these things. But I want you to see one other thing here too. And that is, in another sense, this is strangely appropriate, because he stole a blessing that really has been powerful, and he has prospered greatly. But as much as the blessing is responsible for this, and the blessing was supposed to go to Esau, technically half of what he owns should belong to Esau, since he stole the blessing of the double portion. That makes some sense? So there's a little bit more to this than just trying to butter up his brother. But long story short, Esau hasn't been mad at him for a long time. Esau has been blessed. Esau is rich. He's got a couple wives. He's got kids. And he has stopped being mad at Jacob a long time ago. He's got a good life. And so this is great. Jacob comes home. Esau doesn't want to kill him. They don't end up living in the same place, but at least they've made contact and everything's okay. And, now that we have got Jacob back into Canaan or Canaan land, let's go back to talking about the sons, okay? Now, remember, Rachel has had finally a son. And this is after Leah has had 6, Bilhah's had 2, and Zilpah's had 2. So this is Jacob's 11th son. And yet, because it is the son of Rachel, whom Jacob considers his number one wife, this is the son that Jacob considers is going to get the blessing of the firstborn. And all the other brothers know it. There probably is some resentment in this regard. Rachel, finally late in life, has a second son. This last son is probably much younger than the sons of a lot of his older brothers. Maybe could be the same age as, the grandsons of the oldest brother, So he's much younger. And Rachel is old when she has this second son, Israel's 12th son. She dies in childbirth. And as she is in a great amount of pain and is dying, she names this son that is being born Benoni, which means son of my sorrow. And Israel is brokenhearted. He has always loved Rachel. She's the love of his life. He never stopped loving her. This is a tremendous loss, great amount of sorrow. Nonetheless, he cannot let the second son of Rachel go through life with the name Benoni, son of my sorrow. He renames him Benjamin, or Benjamin. Benjamin means son of the right hand. Now, this is a metaphor that makes it through to today. If you say, this is my right-hand guy or my right-hand gal, what you're saying is, I couldn't do what I do without them. I mean, I rely on them more than anyone else. In terms of royalty, if you stand at the right hand of a king, you have tremendous power. I mean, you may have a signet ring where you can like enact legislation, whatever. To stand at the right hand of a king is about the highest position you can be in, other than being king himself. And if you know anything about Christianity, Jesus is supposed to stand at the right hand of the throne of God. So to say "son of my right hand" is a very exalted title, if you will. And Israel, of course, loves Benjamin. Now, Joseph's still considered his firstborn son. Benjamin is much younger. Benjamin is at home most of the time with Israel, and Israel is a little bit obsessive. He just doesn't want to let Benjamin out of his sight. So Benjamin really is kind of the son of the right hand here. And we'll talk more about this in a bit.